Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series is Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor in the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia. We'll be discussing his new book called Prison Life Writing: Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System. Life writing is a literary genre, mainly nonfiction, that, as you might imagine, tells the story of a person's life, including formats such as diaries, memoirs, and autobiographies. Simon's book is part of a life writing series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of these episodes. In his book, Simon situates life writing squarely in the prison experience. He explores how prison life writing is influenced by institutional constraints, the notion that prisons at one time were intended to convert felons into more productive members of society, and the various ways men and women perceive their own transformations before, during, and after their incarceration. In this second episode, Simon tells us about the conversion narrative and how it uniquely relates to prison life writing. Earlier you mentioned you brought up the autobiography of Malcolm X, and change also plays a huge role in that title as well, and in the sense you talk about conversion. Can you talk about the role conversion plays in the Malcolm X story, and how whether conversion narratives are also tied to resistance literature, and how that fits into life writing in general in this case?
Yeah, totally. So Malcolm X's autobiography is a great example of a conversion narrative. And one of the ways that I track the way that prisoners' life writing is constantly involved in this back and forth with the institution and the discourse of the institution is through the conversion narrative. And so just let me kind of lay out what the conversion narrative is, and I'll use Malcolm X as an example. And then I'll kind of talk about how that relates to the institution and the institution's conversion narrative, because there is an institutional narrative that's going on here. So the conversion narrative is essentially this story of transforming from one way of being to another. And importantly, the conversion narrative is not, say, where you have like a Bildungsroman, where somebody is going through a kind of slow transformation through a kind of experience away from home. And they kind of come back to that home after having that experience, a changed person. The conversion narrative is very much about this kind of large transformation that somebody goes through, very often understood as a kind of sudden transformation. Now, in prison, you very often have this as a kind of transformation of being, one kind of person to being another kind of person. Very often, somebody who is, say, criminal or violent or uneducated to somebody who is no longer a criminal and is a good member of society, or from being uneducated to, say, being a poet or being a writer. Or from being apolitical to being political or a revolutionary. There's a variety of different ways that you see that happening in prison life writing, but all of them follow the same trajectory. And so Malcolm X's autobiography is a good example of this. So Malcolm X, when he's born, his name is Malcolm Little. He then, throughout the course of his life, takes on a variety of different names, and those names kind of signal different changes in his life. He becomes Detroit Red at one point when he's essentially become a hustler. He's robbing people's homes. He gets involved in drugs, and he's eventually sent to prison. And when he's in prison, he takes on the name of Satan, or really it's a name that other people call him. And it's partly because, he has this shock of red hair, but it's partly also because, he's just kind of in a bad mood all the time, in part because he's going through withdrawal. And then when he's in prison, when he's initially in prison, it's important to note that, he's in this kind of fallen state, right? So before he was, if, we think of him, say, as Detroit Red, he's, then gets into prison, he becomes Satan, and, how you can't really fall any lower, right? Like you're really you've hit, as Alcoholics Anonymous would call it, your rock bottom at this stage. But it's here that according to the conversion narrative paradigm, this is where you have your major life transformation, when you've hit your rock bottom. And so at this point, he encounters Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And he ends up having this transformative experience. And this transformative experience where he describes it like his past life slides away from him like snow sliding off a roof, right? It's this sudden dramatic transformation. And he then takes on the name of Malcolm X. Now, it's important to note Malcolm X has several transformations throughout his life. One of his biographers, the name of the biography is A Life of Reinvention. So you have somebody who's throughout his whole life is transforming his life. And yet this moment in prison is really one of the central transformations in Malcolm X's life, and one he often goes back to later when he's a minister for the Nation of Islam. And so there we can kind of isolate this sort of transformational moment that reappears in prisoners' life writings over and over and over again. You have somebody who used to be a hustler, goes to prison, is in this kind of lowest point of his life, has this transformative experience, and comes out the other side. And you see that in those name changes. Mm-hmm. Now, what's important to note also, what's happening there is not just a religious transformation, but also an educational one. So Malcolm was in a prison called Norfolk. And in Norfolk prison, it was very much a kind of revolutionary rehabilitative center, right? And the idea was that it was going to be focused exclusively on rehabilitation and using all sorts of new technologies to make that happen. And education was central to that project. So the idea that prisoners would get an education in that system was very important. And so, what Malcolm X does when he's incarcerated is he starts to read. He starts to read a lot, famously copying out the entire dictionary and reading through the library voraciously. And so part of this transformation is also this transformation through education. And so Malcolm X, when he becomes Malcolm X, this incredible speaker, incredibly well-read, is part of central to that transformation is this transformation through education.
Right.
Now, the prison system, as I've mentioned, also has this same kind of narrative at work in it. The prison, since the very first penitentiary at the beginning of the 19th century, was premised on this idea that it was an institution created for transforming people's identities, for changing criminals into citizens. Now, we often think of prisons as of just kind of always being around, but of course, prisons first appeared really at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And what differentiated them, there are several things that differentiated them from earlier jails that had existed. But what was different with these institutions was the institutions were there to kind of rehabilitate people. Before that, someone would be incarcerated while they, say, awaited their sentence. And then they would be sentenced and then, hung or given lashes or whatever. But when you get into the prison system, the idea is after the sentence, someone is sent into this architectural system, and that architectural system was going to transform them and return them to society as fully functioning citizens, at least in theory.
Yep.
And so you have within the system itself a conversion narrative, and that the system is built around this idea of conversion and transformation. Without kind of going too much into it, that actually has a long tradition in the American criminal justice system. Before that, when somebody went to the scaffold for their punishment, they would go with a minister in, say, Puritan communities. And the minister would help them realize that their punishment could absolve them of their crimes if they confessed, and that they would, if they had this conversion experience on the scaffold, they would then return to God as in heaven as transformed people. When you get to the prison system with a penitentiary, that whole process becomes part of the architectural system of the penitentiary. Right. So one of the things that I'm fascinated with in my book is how you have this institutional narrative of conversion that never really goes away. And then you have prisoners' autobiographies that are also conversion narratives. And then the question is, so what's going on here? Are prisoners' autobiographies that are almost always, or at least men's autobiographies are almost always conversion narratives? How do we understand the ideological work that's going on there? If they are repeating the same story. I transformed from one way of being to another, one less desirable to one that is desirable. If they're following that same process, what's the ideological work that's happening there? And with Malcolm X, you can see him certainly seeming to follow the narrative trajectory of conversion, right? The
Yeah.
one that was prescribed to him and enforced essentially by the prison that he was in, that was requiring him to read, that was really focusing on education as a way to transform him into somebody who would be, better suited for society. But of
Mhm.
course, what Malcolm X was reading was helping him learn about his own oppression, about his own experiences of a Black man in America. And through that process, he's essentially co-opting all of the tools that are there, that are there to kind of change him in the way that the institution wants. He's co-opting those tools as a way to understand himself not as a criminal, but as a victim, and the
Mhm.
institution and the white supremacist society that institution represents, seeing that instead as a criminal enterprise. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So he's doing what the prison system requires of him, but he's doing it in a very different way, and you see that quite often in prisoners' life writings.
Yeah, no, that's great because I was going to ask you if you were able to sort of tease apart the relationship between the institutional kind of approach to conversion and rehabilitation, and how that relates to the individual's approach in their to that in their writing, and whether and how related they are. Whereas I think you were getting at this with in terms of Malcolm X, where yeah, he's using the tools that the prison wants him to use to rehabilitate himself, but he's kind of taking his own initiative to do that too, right? So when do you see, maybe they're in some other in a different era or a different prison environment where someone's practicing, some form of a conversion narrative, that they may be doing it independently of the institution. Are there examples of that as well? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, how can you tell?
yeah,
And what I would say is that you have all sorts of instances of conversion in prison life writing. And what's interesting is that if we think of the text not as an example of somebody articulating their own identity in a way that is entirely theirs, right, and that the book itself is an example of resistance, right? If we kind
hmm
of set that aside and instead see the text itself as sort of a battleground, right? A push and pull with the institution and the discourse of the institution, then I think it changes how we read it, right?
yeah,
So within the text, then we see examples of resistance, but we also see all of these different aesthetic techniques that prisoners are using within the prison as a way to kind of find that way of defining themselves, right? So if we just see Angela Davis's autobiography, or James Carr's autobiography, or George Jackson's autobiography, or Asada Shakur's autobiography as itself just as a kind of as simply resistance, right? Where the prison is essentially external to that.
mm,
We miss the ways that all of these writers are kind of struggling with the institution and the institutional discourse within the texts themselves.
yeah. Are they also, in a sense, using that kind of narrative to control their image? Have exert some control over how they're perceived?
Yeah, definitely. There's a book called "Righting My Wrongs" by Shaka Senghor, which is a fairly recent book, written in the last 10, 15 years. And his book is fascinating because what he does is, and it's not just his book, it's the way the book relates to his life once he's released from prison.
Hmm.
And the book is a classic conversion narrative. So in it, he describes how, it starts with his life, a kind of life of violence, right? A life of poverty, racialized poverty, as a young Black man living within in a world that really kind of puts him in a position of having to engage with this kind of violence. And and how violence gets him into prison. But then once he's in prison, he goes through this process of transformation. That's very familiar at this point. It's very much like Malcolm X, where he starts. It almost seems self-consciously like Malcolm X, where he's doing things like sitting up late at night, reading at the edge of his cell by the light in the hall. And this is stuff that we've seen before. Not to say it's not legitimate, not to say it didn't happen, but to say instead that it's part of a narrative, it's part of a tradition.
Yeah.
And so we have in this story him drawing on that tradition as a way to both represent his experience, but probably also to kind of understand that experience in the moment. So we have him kind of going through this process of transformation. And then, he changes himself into somebody who's a writer, into somebody who's a thinker, into somebody who's also kind of a motivator, right? And a kind of public figure within the institution itself. I mean, he has a group of people who he helps to kind of train and educate with somebody else. But once he gets out of prison, he then starts a series of kind of self-help projects where he pitches himself as a motivational speaker. And central to that is his incarceration, right? So he essentially says, here's my life. I used to be this person. I am now somebody else. I used to be involved in violence and in the drug trade. I transformed myself in prison. I'm now somebody who's gone through this radical change. Look at me, right? And so the book becomes central to that. It becomes the thing that he can point to and say, if you want to know about my life, you want to know where I've been and the kind of road that I've traveled in order to get here, check out my autobiography.
Right.
And then what he's doing, though, and I find this fascinating, is he then is representing himself as a motivational speaker and saying, you two, I will kind of train you how to, in your life, far from the prison, I'm going to train you how to go through a similar transformation as well. He becomes this motivational speaker, and the book becomes central to the justification of that experience. And so I describe that as a kind of what I call carceral capital. So drawing on the prison and the stories of the prison and using it as a way to make money on the outside. And what's fascinating about this is he's literally flipping the way most prisoners, especially Black prisoners, are refused access to the social sphere, to kind of normal society as a result of their conviction. So most people can't get work after they're incarcerated, or the work they can get is very low paid, very exploitative, and they're deliberately kept because of many different laws that keep them outside of normal society, what Michelle Alexander famously described as the new Jim Crow. So for most people, their conviction keeps them away from society, keeps them on the margins of society, keeps them in a position where they're not able to make money. And yet you have Shaka Senghor essentially flipping that and drawing on his prison experience and using that as a kind of justification for his role as a motivational speaker. And I see that actually as a more contemporary phenomenon. There are a number of different examples of this, both in literature, but also more broadly in American culture. There's something that I saw called Con Body, which is a CrossFit type workout a group I think it's in New York, and it's run by formerly incarcerated people. And what they're doing is is using a kind of narrative about prison as a workout space, as a way to kind of use that to help people on the outside get fit. And so the kind of body of the incarcerated person becomes central to that project, and the transformation of that body becomes something that's marketable.
You just heard from Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor in the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he's the author of Prison Life Writing: Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of this series. Join us next week as we dig into the complexities and limits of the conversion narrative and how women's prison life writing has taken on a very different perspective from men's writing.
And then I thought, well, the thing that makes the conversion paradigm so central to prison life writing is in part because it's required by the institution. That these are people who are living in an institution that is at the core of its rehabilitative mandate, is this idea that somebody has to transform themselves from a criminal into a citizen. And so that creates the pressure, the kind of discursive pressure on prisoners to kind of reproduce some version of that narrative in their life writings. And yet in women's institutions, there's a very different story at work there.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And as always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.